Welcome to Winning Words, a celebration of the 19th annual BLR Literary Prizes. I'm Danielle Ofri, Chief Editor of Bellevue Literary Review, and this is the 46th issue of BLR. It's packed with amazing poetry, fiction, nonfiction, plus gorgeous cover art by artist Nicole Cohen. For today's reading and conversation, we're going to start with fiction. BLR's Goldenberg Prize for Fiction was judged this year by Marie Myung-Ok Lee, and the winner is the story Stray Gods by Shastri Akella. Honorable mention went to the story Child by William Klein. Shastri Akella will start us off by reading an excerpt of his story Stray Gods, and then he'll be joined by BLR's Associate Fiction Editor Doris W. Cheng. They will be followed by William Klein reading an excerpt of his honorable mention story Child.
So I thought I'll start off by reading an excerpt from the story. The main character is called Boy, and you'll see why. At 5 p.m., they hear a sputtering engine and a Bollywood song. A mini truck appears at the bend of the road, its body the yellow of egg yolk, surrounded by a halo of smog. It gets close and brings with it a stench like that of stagnant water. The driver's tinted window is raised. They can't see him. When it passes them, the truck slows down and they see the dogs. 4 strays per crate, 4 crates per row, dogs stacked 4 rows tall in the bed of the truck, their snouts pressed to the crate's wooden bars. The dogs see Boy and Madhu too. Their bony shoulders turn alert. Their tails begin to wag. Some are black as the tea Grandpa drinks. Most are some shade of brown with patches of singed fur. One dog is as still as a branch in a windless summer. One of them limps. Her hind leg hovers. She falls under the force of her wagging tail, but stands back up unfazed. Boy bends forward and barks. The dogs bark back, their heads raised. Madhu joins him. When the crates start to wobble with all the canine movement, the truck picks up speed, turns a corner, and is gone. What's he going to do with them? Madhu asks. He rounds them up from our city and takes them to a pit, Boy says, pointing to the road to his left with his chin. He got started 2 weeks back. He controls them with a taser rod. You know what that means? From the corner of his eye, Boy sees Madhu wipe his nose with his fist. He slows down because he wants me to see, Boy says. He's seen you before? Madhu asks. Boy nods. He wants you to see them suffer, Madhu says. It is not a question. Boy clears his throat of the lump that's gathering in his gullet. He asks, want to come with me to work? From 6 p.m. to 1 a.m., Boy works at Lajawab Highway Dhaba, frequented mostly by truck drivers. They park their trucks at the curb, tailgates painted with gaudy portraits of gods and goddesses who look like Bollywood celebrities. A mauve Lakshmi looks like a grinning Priyanka Chopra, a blue Shiva like a moody Karthik Aryan. Underneath are the words that have nothing to do with the deities or the celebrities. Horn, okay please, mom's blessings. When the truck drivers get drunk, they tell Boy stories about faraway places where they collect or deliver goods. They talk about a desert with a river buried underneath its many metric tons of porous sand, temples where you get blessed by elephants. They all call him Boy. Boy when they need a glass of water. Boy when they want their place cleared. He likes it. The neighborhood boys get to attend school, sure, but he's the only one with an English nickname.
The story is about 2 Indian orphans who are young and vulnerable and adrift on the margins of society. And I was struck by how these boys who have so little are able to have so much compassion for the stray dogs in their town, for these living creatures that are even more marginalized than they are. Why did you choose to make dogs such a big part of the story?
Um, I truly believe that when you talk about dehumanization, we often think about stripping someone of their humanity. Uh, but I think it's not possible to dehumanize somebody until you lose your own individuality. You buy into some sort of collective thought, into inherited ideologies, where you see someone not as a person, but as an obstacle in your path, as a trouble that needs to be solved and nothing else. And so dehumanization necessarily involves losing your own sense of individuality and your own humanity. Uh, and that happens whether it's other humans we're looking at and not treating them as humans, or non-humans and not treating them as sentient beings. And what happens with the man who's collecting these dogs in the story is he only sees these dogs as a trouble that needs to be solved. And in return of solving that problem, he gets money. That's all he's doing. And of course, it gets darker than that as the story progresses. Boy, the main character, in Madhu, however, even though they are on the margins and the very fringes of society, as children who come from a working class background with no caregivers, they have not lost their individuality. They have not become dehumanized because they see these dogs as sentient beings. They're not just seeing a collective pack. They're able to identify individual traits. Even in the excerpt that I've read, they really see this one dog that's almost heroic to them because the dog is limping. She's falling down under the force of her own wagging tail, but she stands back up. And these boys have that ability to look at that one specific dog in a big group.
I think that's a really powerful message. And definitely what you were saying about how the process of dehumanization begins with someone losing. It's not about what happens to the object of the dehumanization, but about the person who's committing that act and losing their own humanity. I think your story also says something very powerful about the idea of chosen family and the strength of ties that are forged by friendship and fellowship and care for one another rather than biology. And this happens in the friendship with Boy and Madhu, and also in the sort of parallel with the connections with the dogs, with the way the dogs form packs. And can you talk a little bit more about this, about these kind of connections?
I think this, for me, comes from a very personal space. So until I was about 29, I thought I was asexual. And then I joined the MFA program at UMass Amherst, and I, through the process of writing The Sea Elephants, actually came out. And there was a point where I had a very difficult relationship with my biological family. I was outed to my biological family. I didn't do it by choice. And during that time of a very strained relationship with them, my community in Amherst, where I did my MFA, really came and stood with me. Sabina Marie, my professor, whose class I came out in, she would just host me for days on end, cook with me, take care of me, and just tell me that it's okay. And my friends at that point really became my found family. My best friend in India, who gets a little shout out in the story, her name is Sue Madhavan, and she's one of the truck drivers in the story. She was the first friend I came out to. So I think through that process of coming out, I realized how much friendships mean to those of us who live on the fringes, and we go out into the world and make our own family because for various reasons, our own biological families are not able to be present for us. And for me, found family is really about that idea of truly being present for each other in a very unconditional way, of being loved irrespective of who you are. So even though Boy and Madhu are isolated, they find each other. They find in that friendship this idea of found family where they can really be present for each other. They can go out into the woods and play games. And if they want to save the dogs, they will work with each other to save the dogs. There's no sense of judgment there.
Absolutely. You wrote a beautiful essay in LitHub that kind of touched on these things that you're talking about and talked about your personal experience traveling with a group of actors in India and how that experience informed your novel and helped you come to a deeper understanding of your identity. And I think that touches on what you're saying about kind of being pulled from the filters, the people who know you and the place that knows you, and just being completely in a different space. Can you talk about that experience and the genesis of the story? I mean, did to write the story, did you draw from any part of that experience?
A little bit in that, when my the hometown I grew up in had this problem of a lot of stray dogs running rampant in the city, and people were upset, and the government was very busy with other projects, and they didn't have time to, in a more humane way, take care of the dogs that were running around the city. And so, a friend and I, when we were walking down back from school, we saw a truck pass by, and the truck, like in the truck in the story, was stacked with all of these stray dogs, except they were not even in crates. They were just stacked one on top of the other, even though they were alive. They were treated as nothing more than a sack of sand or a sack of bricks that were just tossed onto the truck. And we could see the dogs that were at the lowest level were dead, and they were suffering. And so we ran after the truck. We didn't have a vehicle. We didn't have cell phones. I came from a very working class background. I did not have a cell phone until pretty much I came to the US and started my master's. And so we thought of what can we do to stop this from happening. And we would walk down that street every day around the same time to see when this truck comes by and how we can stop it. And so one day we saw the truck coming by, and we stopped the truck, and we tried talking to this man, and he had no interest in having a conversation with us. And when we said, "We'll call the cops," he laughed and said, "Sure, go ahead. I'm waiting right here." So he had no fear. And there was not much we could do for these dogs until we got in touch with a nonprofit, which is sort of like a local Blue Cross in India. And eventually they intervened. It took a long while. And for the longest of time, I was very young. I was like 12 years old. And I think I kept thinking of, oh, what if I could have done something? What if we could actually punish this man for treating the dogs in such a poor way? And I think fiction is an amazing space for the imagination to realize what you cannot realize in life. And so that it stayed with me for years until I ended up writing this story.
Right. Definitely, I agree with you about that, about fiction being a way to answer these questions that you have in life. And something I did wonder about at the end of Stray Gods, the boys take decisive action. And despite their position in society, they aren't powerless. They have the agency to do something about somebody who's threatening to harm them. What do you think happens to them after the story is over? What do you imagine that their lives look like?
I think for me, it's the first moment where when they do take the decisive action and they are able to help the dogs out in whatever capacity that they can. It's the first time where this voice that a lot of us, I use this phrase, a lot of us who live on the fringes, and I don't mean that as a judgment. I think there is power to be on the fringes because you don't have to abide by the laws of the norm. And so these boys who are on the fringes, they don't have to abide by any laws of saying, oh, you cannot confront an adult. You have to listen to grown-ups. And yet, even they have inherited this voice of that they don't really matter in the bigger scheme of things, that their voice is not important. And for the first time, when they're able to help these dogs and free them, they've reached a point where they know that voice was wrong, that they can make a difference if they want to. And it is a first step in the direction of their own self-realization, of their understanding of their own agency, as you say. And they're still very little, and they're still navigating and understanding their role in the world. And I think in those formative years for these kids to know that their voice matters is so important. They've come of age at a fairly young point in life, and they've realized that when they want to make a difference, they can, and they don't need any kind of endorsement to do it.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. This was a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Child is about Ronald and Cass. Ronald is an insecure white guy, and Cass is a black woman whose left hand is disabled. They live in Philadelphia and are both writers for a pop culture news site. And this is Child. In November, 3 months after they'd first met, Cass said, "I miss you when you're not around. My place is too big. Yours is too far. We're both paying too much. It's soon to move in together, okay, but it makes sense, right?" "Absolutely," he said, feeling he was clasped beside her on a roller coaster. 3 months isn't too soon, not for us, especially not compared to proposing, which he had been considering. Cass lived in a Northern Liberty's loft with hardwood floors, exposed brick, an entire wall of wrought iron windows. "I'm so happy you're here," she said, hugging him from behind while he still panted from bringing his first box up the 4 flights of stairs. Her thin wrists cinched his belly, her collarbone, her sharp shoulders, even her ribs. He felt them all needle into his soft, rotund places. Shame flowed from those places. It coughed out of his inhaler, crusted on him where movie stars had muscles, but he had overflowing hands when he clutched himself in the mirror. Sometimes it collected and congealed in him like some black wad he couldn't hack up. No, he thought, some poisonous wad. He put his left hand over Cass's and focused on feeling her warm skin. Blanketed in snow that fell infinitely when they were home, they spent their time in bed. Her eyes glowed from her laptop, cross-legged on their mattress, wearing a plush robe that fell open at the chest. In bed, he wore only boxers. He felt exposed, but he knew that she felt exposed even when fully dressed. He borrowed her bravery so that he could be accessible to her as she wanted to be to him. While they were apart, Cass sent 3 messages. "Merry Christmas," "Happy New Year," and "Can't message now, they hear my phone buzz through the wall." She had told Ronald movies were a connection with her mother, but she didn't talk about her home life otherwise, and he guessed she had meant they were her only connection. She wrapped herself around him when they slept. He got mad at a world that hadn't loved her enough. He felt grateful it had made her his. They both came home on the second day of the new year, Ronald plunking onto the couch to smoke. "Hit me," Cass said, grinning and bratty, flopping across his lap. "I'm waiting." She had bought him a giant oyster shell for an ashtray, a box of Kauri wood for his pot. It was rare she smoked with him. Ronald positioning the pipe and lighter for her, controlling the carb. "My valiant child, Roland," she wheezed, keeping in the smoke. "Child, child." The word puffed on his face like the fog outside. Spring had invaded late January. The ice knotting the riverbanks had rotted and decomposed over a weekend. Rare fog boiled in to shroud downtown. Ronald and Cass piled their coats, scarves, hats, and mittens in a corner, suspicious of putting them away too early. Cass only called him child when they were alone at home. It made him feel that she was enormous and wise, that some great other Cass cradled them both. She licked her thumb, rubbed ash off his hand, held it against her cheek, eyes closed. Was it time? Should he? But no, not when they were stoned on the couch. He had bought simple silver wedding bands from an antique store. He'd barely learned to navigate the city, even when it wasn't befogged, and so, while he remembered that the store was in a basement a couple of blocks off Jewelers Row and that taxidermied pheasants roosted in the windows, he could never find his way back.
Thank you, Shastri. Thank you, Doris. And thank you, William. We now turn to poetry. This year, BLR's John and Eileen Allman Prize for Poetry was judged by Melissa Lozada Oliva. The winner is the poem Dementia Unit for John Glenn by Amy Rothschild. Honorable mention went to the poem It Has Nothing to Do with Argentina by Carolene Kurien. We'll start with Amy Rothschild reading her winning poem, Dementia Unit for John Glenn, and then she'll be joined in conversation with BLR's assistant poetry editor, Saleem Hughpenny. This will be followed by Carolene Kurien reading her honorable mention poem, It Has Nothing to Do with Argentina.
Dementia Unit for John Glenn. At sunrise, I peel off our young astronaut's blue striped pajamas and coach him through suiting up for his next mission. You toss a pale bagel onto his plate. Do some hand waving around the problem of gravity. Glenn says no go to the potty, but we say go, 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 and begin counting down. How it would have thrilled me to know when we packed all our things into your dad's Camry, fumbled and cursed, built the dresser backwards, broke the mugs, lost the spare key, booked the wrong train, that someday we don headsets in Houston, learn physics, float weightless, plant a flag on the moon to say, kid, please just try.
Thank you so much, Amy. I just wanted to linger in the last sound of that just try. So thank you so much for that reading. Looking forward to chatting with you. Kind of been thinking about poem, poet, process, because all three of those are incredibly important. So after hearing your poem, I'm pretty struck by the speaker's keen sense of observation of the kind of the particularities of childhood. You have a background as an early childhood educator, and I'm curious, how does this professional experience influence your poetry? It could be this poem in specific, if that's relevant.
Sure. I think your mention of observation really calls to mind some of the best sort of education and training I got early in my career, which is that the core work of an early childhood teacher is to observe. I've heard mentors say, don't just do something, sit there, as sort of the mantra. And I think that sort of power of observation, of being able to sort of be fully present and also in some ways absent oneself, is something that we employ, when we are working with children, when we are writing poetry, when we are parenting. And I feel lucky to sort of get to do that in different forms.
Yeah, that's an amazing through line to kind of be able to connect those, and having observation sort of be a piece of that across. You kind of alluded to a little bit. I'd be curious briefly, if and how does raising a young child show up in your work, or maybe your approach to writing, both?
I think that for me, being with children is sort of, puts me in contact with wonder, as it does for many of us. And I feel very, very lucky to be a parent. It's something that, because of my medical history, it was a long journey to get there. And then there's this sense that it is just sort of so fleeting. And if you think about it, I guess like the romantic poets were, meditating on like the fleeting daffodil, the delicate blooms. And for me, I guess I seek to sort of set down in writing some of these experiences that feel like they are sort of in the past at the same moment that they are happening for the first time. And in this poem in particular, the experience of working with young children, of raising my son, of having, grandparents who've experienced dementia, sort of space travel offered a way to sort of bend time and weave all of those elements together.
That's incredible. And it's also one thing you brought up is, for adults, I feel like time is so much more, linear. A couple hours ago, my wife just said, our kids are 9. We only have 9 more years with them at home. We're halfway through them being at home. And like the last 2 hours, I've just been like, oh my gosh, like halfway. What does that mean? But our daughter still doesn't always know if it's Wednesday or Sunday, because she's just like, I'm just here and I've got on my favorite socks. So yeah, time is very relative. One thing that's incredible about your work that I don't know if people will have gotten to see if they're just getting introduced, something I think is undervalued, definitely in the poetry circles I'm in, which is humor. Like some of your stuff is just it's straight LOL. So I wanted to see if I could reference briefly just a couple lines from a piece. It's this great sort of satirical piece looking at submit calls for submissions. And so you have this one called Open Call for Submissions, Poplar Street Review. Poplar Street Review seeks original work that has not previously appeared online. We seek to showcase work from people who previously rented on the 400 to 500 block of Poplar Street and since have relocated to North Sturbridge Ave, near where it intersects 9th. We're seeking concrete poems that treat the topic, assembling the IKEA mom dresser with the current former lover, and it just keeps going, and it's brilliant. And so I'm so curious of why humor. Just why humor? Why not heartbreak?
I mean, I think the humor in some ways connects very much to, as you say, like the experience of working with young children. Those of us who are engaged in, in whatever form, the young, the old, in between, with acts of caregiving, and the sort of, just daily grind, and also like sublime absurdities, I think tend to rely on humor. There's like few people that I've laughed with as much as, my co-teachers or, my spouse when parenting. And I mean, frankly, I don't take myself that seriously. And there's this sort of push-pull in writing where you sort of have to have a certain confidence to believe that what your words matter. But sort of really believing that would make a person somewhat intolerable, I think, in some ways. And I think that sort of coming to writing as I have in my now like late 30s, I've sort of had to create an identity elsewhere, like through friendships, through teaching. I didn't sort of, set out like I am a poet and I'm going to play that part and that will be my way walking through the world. So I'm trying to really just like treasure and enjoy the chance to create, and also to hold it really lightly. It's also it's just extremely humbling. I've heard people say that like writing brings out the very best in us, and publishing brings out the worst. The piece you referenced, I've just had that experience of thinking like, wow, they're really looking for me. They want like mother writers in Massachusetts, like with a kid this age, like I've got this. And then it's like, no, nobody wants to read it.
Well, I'm glad that your work has found a home in BLR, and I hope that even if we don't have that special call for IKEA mom themed furniture, I hope that other folks watching and tuning in will continue to stay active readers. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your contribution. Not only an honor to read your work, but to connect and hear about the process and the person behind the work. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It has nothing to do with Argentina and everything to do with this uncertain skin, wobbling around, finding solidity in injections only available in a limited number of countries. I don't wish to hold you back. I don't wish to unstraddle you from the horses you ride into horizon, sog the receipt poems you write inside mate bars with my tears of ache. the burden of this body is the burden of gravity. Nothing can stop the come down. No matter the birds, no matter the plane, no matter the sole pear leaf, fluttering terribly in the wind. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Saleem. And thank you, Carolene. And last but definitely not least is nonfiction. This year, BLR's Felice Buckfar Prize for Nonfiction was judged by Edgar Gomez. The winner was the essay Anticipatory Grief by Misty Kiwak Jacobs. Honorable mention went to the essay Officium by Siobhan McKenna. We'll start with Misty Kiwak Jacobs reading an excerpt of her essay Anticipatory Grief, and then I will jump back in for a conversation with her. This will be followed by Siobhan McKenna reading an excerpt of her honorable mention essay Officium.
I'm going to start a little bit in the middle of a passage from when I was 8 or 9 at a swap meet, park and swap with my mother in downtown Phoenix. Somehow I paid $5 for an antique padlock the size of my hand, maybe with one of the $5 bills my grandmother sent in birthday cards. My grandmother, who raised 7 children working in a glove factory back in Indiana. The lock was caramel colored, battered. A thin steel key sat in the keyhole, the head of which was clover shaped, a hole in each petal of the clover. The lock was heavy, like my mother's turquoise jewelry. At Christmas, I wrapped it and gave it to my father. He liked it. The lock was in my father's living room for the rest of his life, sometimes on the bookshelf, sometimes on the side table. Pride of place. February 2022. My best friend in Arizona, Maria, texts me about her husband. Gary has cancer. It's bad. As a new Christian in my 20s, I had aspired to be a nun, and so I had the requisite spiritual director, an old Spanish priest named Father Marcel. I wrote him letters from college, and once a month I sat in an old wooden phone booth on the ground floor of a campus mansion in Bronxville, New York, and called him in Arizona to talk about what I thought God was doing. What God was doing, at least for a time, was calling me to live among nuns in white cotton saris, living in poverty and orderliness, praying on the floor and sleeping on thin, lumpy mats covered in blue ticking for 6 hours, 40 minutes a night. Each morning, the aspirants and sisters prayed lauds, scattered like dropped handkerchiefs on the chapel floor. Across the hall, the kitchen sister quietly lined cutting boards on the counters, each board with a vegetable, carrot or onion or cucumber or pepper, just a bit chopped or diced or minced or julienned as an example, so that after morning prayer, we could enter, don aprons, and begin working wordlessly. When I raised my children, I told them to move lightly about the kitchen as if the nuns were praying in the chapel across the hall. Now grown, my children are angry with me for a number of things in their childhood, but for some reason, this is not one of them. Years later, after I had already entered and left the convent, Father Marcel was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. To arrive at a deathbed uninvited seems like gawking at someone's private interface with God, at someone's ultimate humility. I am a chaplain and soon to be, God willing, and the people consenting, an Episcopal priest. I've been at the side of dozens and dozens of deathbeds. When invited as a chaplain, it seems like the natural order of things. Reduced appetite, more sleep, visions of dead relatives. Oh, and here's the chaplain. Father Marcel died 6 weeks after his diagnosis. I never went to his bedside. It was when Father Marcel died that I really knew my father would also die. I wept and wept and wept. Maria texts again. Gary has pancreatic cancer. One day in 8th grade, outside the cafeteria in the white, hot Arizona sun, standing with a friend, I pulled up my shirt to reveal a lemony plum bruise the size of my mother's fist rising over my ribs. Girls of the time were not schooled in agency and self-advocacy. We were immersed in beauty and flirting. We whispered the secrets of eating disorders like nubile witches casting spells over one another's bodies. I didn't expect my friend's help. I just wanted her to bear witness to my grappling with living, with cause and effect, with how a body responds to the vicissitudes of this world. In 2003, a week before my father died, pain, roiling like a tempest in my gut, pulled me to the floor. I knelt, my face in my hands, as a storm roared out of my throat like rage. For 3 years after my father died, I could not speak of him without crying. But I would never cry like I cried that night when he was still alive. I was at my father's bedside when he died, the worst moment of my life. In the 2 hours I stayed by his body, eternity wafted in, briefly displacing grief. After my father died and before my sister showed up at his house like museum acquisitions with a moving van, I walked through his living room and slipped the antique padlock into my pocket.
Misty, thank you so much. That was just wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, this essay is very complex, and our readers just today heard a small excerpt. And I urge everyone out there to read the full thing, because what you'll realize is that this is a complicated, very braided story, and there's multiple strands in there. So one of the strands, which we did not hear about, but is the whole story of your own interactions with a Russian neurologist with the pain in your spine. There's the story of your friend Gary and his cancer, and of course the history with your father and your mother. So I'm curious if that was the original structure and how the essay came to be with all these different stories together.
Honestly, I don't have a very linear brain. I kind of liken it to memory, the way memory interrupts our daily lives and interrupts our dreams and interrupts, the happiest times with sad memories and vice versa. Connections start to be made and I just keep writing.
Did you have to write each of the stories separately and then put them together? Or you started and just kept digressing?
I started and just kept digressing for clarity. And I workshopped this story at Divinity School. Christopher Wyman was my writing teacher and my thesis advisor. And he would have me arrange things for clarity because I own that accusation that I go on tangents. And I know I can be a problem for editors. So I do, it comes out pretty much as you see it. And then I try to edit for logic and clarity.
Now the title and the theme is anticipatory grief, which is such an evocative term. And could you talk to us about whether that was what you started with or what you came to after you wrote the piece, and what anticipatory grief means to you?
Well, the piece started, or I guess the seed of it was what's the last scene in the essay. It was part of a sermon on Holy Week a few years ago. And it's the scene where Mary Magdalene is quite emotional. She understands that Jesus is going to die. And she responds emotionally, sort of losing herself beyond the normal anointing a guest's head with oil. She spills the perfumed oil. The house fills with fragrance. She slips. She wipes his feet with her hair. It's all very emotional and chaotic. And so that started in a sermon, which I told and which I try to do in my preaching, told from a feminine perspective, from an, if I may say, sensory and emotional perspective. I'm trying to validate that in a 2,000-year-old church, which emphasizes the patriarchal and the logical. And so that scene, to me, that was anticipatory grief. Jesus wasn't dead yet.
And how do you find that in people you talk with, either in your congregation or friends, what role does anticipatory grief play in our everyday lives?
I'm trying to validate the emotional aspects of things. I was in the Catholic Church for 25 years where there really was no avenue for women to express themselves. So the best homiletics, the best sermons are interpreting ancient scripture to modern day. And so I'm trying to show people how stories like that are relevant, how there is grief presented in that scripture. There's sensuality presented in that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what it brings to me is maybe we're all living with some amount of anticipatory grief in our lives because we're thinking ahead to losses and how that informs our daily life. But you actually lead me to my next question, which is, you are an Episcopal priest, and how does that factor into your writing?
I've been preaching for a number of years. I started my MDiv in 2017, and I've only just recently arrived at my own congregation. It's a joyful place. The people are loving, but I know who's critical. I know who's disapproving. I know who demands a lot of attention. I know who's still suspicious of my presence or wish they had called a different priest. When I first started writing seriously was probably in 2014. I started with a blog, and all I knew to write about was the pain I had with a difficult mother. And it was still quite angry then. And the essay I read today alludes to it. For me as a priest, I'm called to get past that anger and to see the humanity and the loveliness of even very difficult people.
It's interesting. I hadn't realized that the last scene of the story is actually from a sermon. And I'm curious, as a writer, when you're using religious scenes and references, there may be some people in the audience who don't know that, who haven't read, this version of the Bible and will not know that. How do you navigate that as a writer?
I think scripture is so ancient. I mean, the Hebrew scriptures extend back at least 3,000 years. And written by lawyers and sages and poets and historians, that there are so many stories that they're often new even to people who are in church or temple every weekend. I mean, I grew up unchurched. I became a Christian in my early 20s. I was in very conservative Catholic spheres. I left the church. I somehow accidentally ended up becoming an Episcopal priest. I never dreamed of this. Right before, maybe a year before I entered divinity school, I thought church people were crazy and I never wanted to go back. So I feel like I bring the perspective of having been raised secular and finding church or church people somehow critical or trying to, hog tie my liberty to being very conservative and thinking I had all the answers and I had God in a very tidy package, to having all that bust open and being a woman in a role that is traditionally male.
Well, sounds like quite a lot of fodder for being a writer, I must say. So I'm wondering, which writers or poets do you look toward for inspiration?
I am a rather chaotic, sporadic writer, and I'm a rather chaotic reader. In my 30s, when I was still a stay-at-home mom and Catholic and trying very hard to present everything quite right and trying very hard to do right, I read Anne Sexton. And it was the first time I found a container for a woman's experience and for it to not be positive. There's so much toxic positivity in conservative Christianity, especially for mothers. So that was the first time I sensed that it was okay to have these very complicated feelings about raising children and creating a home. And it was probably about 2012, I read Joy Harjo's Crazy Brave. And she sort of built on my experience with Anne Sexton. Crazy Brave is a very intuitive, emotional, liminal story. And Joy Harjo is weaving in and out of past, present, and future and ancestors and a woman's intuition. And it was the first time I read that gave me permission to write as a woman and to access that kind of liminal and emotional and sometimes mystical space. Two other things that came to mind was Japanese haiku, the ancient ones. I had the book here somewhere. Basho, Busan, and Isa, because they encapsulate the transcendent in just a few words. Maybe 5 or 6 words. They encapsulate what for me is God, this transcendent beauty that speaks throughout centuries. And then I care much about memory. I write a lot about memory. And so I read Laurie Lee's Cider with Rosie a few years ago and how he captures childhood and sort of majestic scenes you see as a child, which we don't see quite the same way as adults.
Well, those are excellent recommendations. Thank you so much, Misty Kiwak Jacobs.
Thank you.
Officium is about my time caring for patients as a nurse in the ICU, which stem from my own questions about mortality. This is Officium. How do you do it? How do you watch people die day after day? He asked the question as we passed each other on the threshold of his wife's room. He was leaving after having said all the goodbyes that could be spoken with words. I was arriving, the night shift nurse gone, and my arms stacked with towels, washcloths, and a gray basin. As every death necessitates, I was to perform a final washing for my patient. Scarcely an hour had passed since her husband had lost his partner and best friend, and somehow he had merged through his grief to ask a question that I, myself, still struggled to understand. Over my mound of supplies, I met his gaze. "We just do," I replied. I couldn't tell him the truth. Not then. There wouldn't have been time to explain. The truth is, I like it. I like taking care of a person as they're dying. The incredulity of witnessing the final exhalations of a person's life overpowers the melancholy. And my proximity to death did not happen as an accident. I arrived at this position because I was frightened of the next life, or lack thereof. As a high school graduate on the eve of the rest of my existence, I'd experienced the first grapplings with my own impermanence that summer before college. One August night, standing on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, its black water indistinguishable from the night sky, I felt my mortality and was overcome with crippling fear. Where do we go? What does it mean to die? The mystery of humanity had hurtled into my lap, but my 12 years of Catholic religion lessons proved to be of little solace. That night, I curled in my parents' bed. My mother laid next to me, stroking my hair. My father brought me frozen M&Ms. I held them and cried as the dye bled onto my hands. My parents gently prodded me with questions, wondering if someone had died to have triggered my mortality meltdown. I shook my head, staring at the candy, sweating colors into my palm. Like many 18-year-olds, I chose to sink these anxieties into my bones and hope they disappear. But instead, they festered and intensified. With time, or perhaps after listening to a This American Life episode about a hospice nurse, I decided that the best way to ease my fear of the afterlife would be to confront mortality directly. I became a nurse, thinking that the profession might give me a chance to examine whatever life's end truly held. The spiritual, the bizarre, the mundane. I quickly learned I was right. There is no better place to observe the dying than in an ICU. Dying in an ICU can be a slow, drawn-out process. This is frequently because the decision to transition to end-of-life care often comes only after weeks of conversations with the medical team, the families, and sometimes the patients if they are lucid. Comfort care entails ceasing supportive IV medications, stopping the mechanical ventilator, and prioritizing pain management over prolonging life. From a medical perspective, this shift in care occurs when the prospect for a patient's recovery and return to a good quality of life is no longer feasible. From a patient and family perspective, it means letting go and allowing nature to take its course. In the past, family members were tasked with caring for the loved ones in the home until they passed on. Instead, corpses are now handled with efficiency by strangers, as Christine Quigley writes in her book, The Corpse, A History. Quigley is not entirely mistaken, but I have two objections to her statement. First, I shudder when I hear the word corpse. They are still my patients. The color has not yet drawn from their faces. Their families are at the bedside. They are not empty shells. Second, it feels perplexing to be labeled as a stranger. In a basic sense, it's true, but her statement does not capture the warmth of my arms around a daughter as her 96-year-old mother departs. It doesn't capture the whispers of, "I know, there's never enough time." Quigley forgets the days, weeks, and occasionally months of caring for a corpse before death arrives, of listening to spouses and children share memories about their loved ones, and even with the families that I have less time with, the barrier of the unfamiliar strips away during these intimate interactions.
Thank you, Misty, and thank you, Siobhan. Thank you to all the authors who participated in today's reading, Shastri, Akella, and William Klein for fiction, Amy Rothschild and Carolene Kurien for poetry, Misty Kiwak Jacobs and Siobhan McKenna for nonfiction. And thank you to BLR editors Doris W. Cheng and Saleem Penny. I want to add a special thank you to the Goldenberg and Buckfar families who sponsor BLR's fiction and nonfiction prizes, as well as to BLR board members Linda Lombardi and Lesma Frazier, who support the Almond Poetry Prize. I also want to acknowledge all the BLR editors and reviewers who bring all this wonderful writing to the page. And thank you to all the writers who contribute to BLR's 46th issue. Together, you've created an incredible assemblage of writing. If you haven't gotten your copy of BLR yet, please visit us at www.blreview.org. You can browse BLR's previous events, read poems, stories, and essays from previous issues. And we hope you'll join the BLR community as a subscriber. Your subscription helps nurture the writing you heard today and helps us to continue to bring new voices to the table. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next event.